My name is Christopher Davis, and this is a presentation on recording peer assessment data in large classes. I'm going to talk a little bit in general about why peer assessment's good, but really the point of this presentation is why you might want to record that data if you're in a very large class situation of 100 plus students. So to jump right in, what I'm going to do throughout this presentation is start with this theoretical overview. Start with why we'd use peer assessment, why bother even recording the data? We could just have students peer assess each other, not record it. And then what are the limitations? Talk a decent bit about rubrics, because those are really going to form the core of this assessment strategy. How to make a good one and how to make one that's appropriate to large class peer assessment. And then conclude with very much practical how-to. For conducting the peer assessment in large classes, I'm going to give you a specific strategy using online survey tools. I'm going to use Qualtrics, but other online survey tools will possibly work, including things like Microsoft Forms, JotForms, SurveyMonkey, some things like that. So to start, we asked this question, which is why use peer assessment in large classes? And really, I think an important part is that we know that feedback is an important part of the learning process. There's tons and tons of materials written on this, but it's very difficult to do if you're a single instructor or working with a couple other co-instructors and you have 100 to 500 students. Individualized feedback is very, very difficult. So how do we access that powerful learning strategy? Well, peer feedback is one way to do that, and peer assessment's a good way to start peer feedback. Beyond that, there's this idea that is conducting assessment, and peer assessment is one form of assessment, is a very powerful active learning strategy for the students themselves. As they conduct the assessment, they're going to learn something about the quality of the thing they're assessing, and hopefully then be able to internalize some of those skills, maybe do some self-reflection, and improve those skills on their own. So this is definitely an active learning strategy that you can implement in large classes, and we're always looking for more of those. This idea of peer assessment results, especially if you're able to record them, like in this presentation, gives you some formative assessment data. I find in large class situations, it's very easy to, as an instructor, look at that sea of faces and have a really hard time telling if people are understanding really well, not understanding at all, or somewhere in the middle. Some sort of assessment data lets us look for the strengths and weaknesses in our teaching and maybe some things we need to emphasize or change in the future. So why record the data? And like I said, formative assessment is probably one of the premier reasons. Identifying strengths and weaknesses of a current course is really important in large class situations. Some grading procedures can come from a recording of the data. I don't generally suggest that you use the peer assessment results to form a student's grade. So if 9 peers all give you a 55% out of 100, that we should use that as some sort of grade. But I do think that there's something to be said for using check grades for the participation in peer assessment, because like I said, we do know that peer assessment and conducting assessments in general is a high impact learning strategy. So if you record the data, you're at least going to be able to see who is participating in those assessment activities, and thus hopefully increasing their learning. Recording data also sets the stage for longitudinal assessment. Of course, it's not perfect data, it's peer data. And, you know, we're generally in large class situations, you find people fairly early in their programs. But if you're consistently repeating things using a similar rubric or similar activities later in the course or program, or you're looking beyond the scope of just a single course, or even within the semester at the start and the end of the semester, you have some opportunities for longitudinal assessment. That's fantastic in a large class situation because, again, you can have a lot of students who seem like they're understanding, but we don't really know because we don't have a whole lot of data. The most important one is always student level data on outcomes. Incredibly difficult to get in large class situations. And large class situations are one of those times where we see that red flag student, that student that needs some interventions, not getting it. Oftentimes they never have an opportunity to raise their hand, or they won't raise their hand, or simply put, they can't hear what's going on. And it's always frustrating as an instructor when you sit there and you go, hey, if this person had just come to me, if they come and talk to me, I could have helped them tremendously in the space of a few minutes. unfortunately, that's a burden on the students to come to you. Now, again, we hope college age students are able to do that. But this is one more form of data that gives us a way to look for students who may need a little bit of intervention. And that sort of student level data on outcomes, very difficult to find other than that sort of summative testing that you see in large scale classes. So I do think this is very important. Again, not perfect data, but not perfect data is sometimes better than no data. So what are the limitations? The first one is that the rubric forms the core of the strategy I'm going to give to you here. And if you don't have a strong rubric, the rest of this is going to be very difficult. Your rubric also needs to be clearly linked to your assignment and works well with a population you don't have to train. Using a rubric should be a very, very simple thing to do as opposed to other peer assessment strategies like write some comments, right? That's actually a much more difficult type of assessment to conduct than using a very well done rubric. Another limitation is that peers are simply not instructors nor subject matter experts. I would tell you generally as a piece of advice to avoid peer assessment situations where you have one person assessing the peer, right? So people partner up and then assess each other. Okay, as an in-class learning activity, that's great. But for something that you really want people to consider the data they're getting from their peers, one person is not going to be very helpful because you're going to have a lot of situations where that person's opinion is simply not correct. However, in the situation like I'm going to present in a few minutes, when you have 9 other people assessing you or your peer, then you can kind of figure out what those real outlier ones are and ignore them. What we want to avoid is that situation where the outlier is the only data a student would get. There's definitely some technological hurdles. A large part of this presentation is how to minimize these, how to do this quickly and efficiently. But do be aware that you will run into some technology problems, even just people missubmitting data. Like these things will happen. You're going to have a way to deal with these. So, what do you need? An assignment appropriate to peer assessment. Not all assignments are appropriate to peer assessment. I'll address that more in the next couple of slides. Some form or survey tool. I'm going to be using Qualtrics. I find it to be a very useful platform, and it exports its results to Excel and comma separated value, which is really useful. Microsoft Forms also does this. I'm not completely familiar with that platform. A lot of people have used PDFs using Adobe to create some sort of form and then hosted that on a server. That's a really great situation if you're comfortable with that level of SQL. And then there's some third-party proprietary tools online that may be useful. Some of these also have limitations, like they'll only accept, say, 50 or 100 submissions a month. So do be aware of that if you're trying to get 900 submissions. You definitely need that high-quality rubric, and I'll talk about that in more detail later. And you need a place to host the form. Now, most people working at massive universities don't have problems finding a little bit of web space to host the form. And if you're using a platform like Qualtrics, you'll just host it directly on there. But that process, if you have to go through IT or through purchasing, can take a little while. So I'd suggest you start that a long time before the semester starts in which you'd be using this sort of large class peer assessment. Some way to distribute link to students. Most common one is through a learning management platform in a hybrid situation, which is very common in large classes. And then some student and peer ID numbers. And these need to be distributed to students. This is a really important tip because when you ask students to spell each other's names, you have all sorts of misspellings and questions, and your data gets corrupted very, very, very quickly. I would always suggest distributing peer ID numbers and making them unique to your class so that you're not distributing a number like a university ID number that's perhaps connected to some confidential information. Finally, very importantly, a strategy for analyzing and using the data. I talked a lot about formative assessment earlier. If that's a strategy you want to use, if that's an analysis pattern you want, then make sure that you're going to get data back that can be used for formative assessment. If that's not your goal, if you have other things that you want to do with the data, then structure your peer assessment in a way that's going to give you useful data. Really consider this before you put an assessment in the field. I to be very careful of certain types of error, I would always caution against data dredging. You don't want to just gather a whole lot of data and then kind of glance over it. You want to have a purposeful use for your data after it's gathered. And to do that, you need to put some thought in before the data gathering process to see what that use might be. So this idea of an appropriate assignment's a key one. And I love peer assessment, and I use it casually in lots of classes. But if we're going to take the time to record, 900, 2,000 responses, we need to make sure we have an assignment that's appropriate. And that, again, like I said previously, this data is going to be useful. So the best ones are the ones where students produce a unique product, because that gives their peers something to assess. Here's a couple of examples. I'm going to highlight this third one here because I've been doing it for a couple of years, and that's where students design a website for a small business, record their efforts using screencast software. We can kind of go in two ways with this. We can provide them a rubric asking them to assess the website, and we can provide them a rubric asking them to assess the presentation using the screencast software. And depending upon your context of your class, you might do a little bit of both. Depends on which variables you're interested in. But the whole idea here is that each student's doing something a little different, but the latent trait below that, this idea of a website appropriate for a small business and website design and presentation skills using screencast software, is the same for all students. So each student has a different product, but we have one rubric that we can distribute to all of them. That's kind of the ideal situation. That's what you're going to want to be looking for or trying to set up in your classes. Similarly, when students are participating in non-identical experiences, but have the same latent traits that would underlie their performance in them. So here's a couple of examples. The second one is, again, what I'm going to highlight here because that's what my example is. So when we have medical students participating in clinical simulations, there's certain things that they need to do. I'm going to talk about oral communication throughout my example, but they all need to communicate orally well. The simulations are not identical. In certain simulations, you have a wide variety of medical issues, but the communication underlying variables the same. That's the sort of assignment that's really appropriate to peer assessment in large groups. So conversely, what's not good assignments? You don't want your students talking about historical literature-based papers. Often students are not equipped to respond to these, even with the rubric. There's a huge problem with interference with things like grammar, word style, which again, students may not be qualified to comment upon. So I would generally avoid anything that sounds like a paper. You might have better luck with like critiques, but historical literature-based papers tend to not work well with this strategy. Anything where students are expected to produce identical results does not give you good peer assessment data because it's about students following a model or following directions, and that's not a latent trait we care about in higher education. Hopefully they can follow directions. We're interested in really those variables that control their performance. General discussion forums, question and response assignments, similar to the previous one, you have a lot of very identical results, and people tend to assess on whether or not they fit some ideal response rather than what the rubric says. They also do not tend to have a whole lot of substantial creative work behind them, which makes it very difficult to assess latent traits. If a person isn't putting in tons of effort, it makes us harder to see what their traits are. So here's a brief overview of the context in this example. And like I said, we're talking about medical students here. They're in clinicals. There's 180 students in this class. This was actually designed for first-year medical students. And they have a whole lot of classes that they take together, including large group ones. And then they participate in these simulated clinical experiences. 18 groups, approximately 10 students per group. It's not always 10. And we've given them ID codes that look like this. It's G and then 2 numbers and then S and then 2 numbers, right? Their peer assessment opportunity is about clinical communication. So one student participates as a doctor. Patient actors, who are people hired by the hospital to emulate a certain condition, portray this pre-designed case study. Not all the students undergo the same scenario. And the rubric is not about whether they've dealt well with a particular scenario. In fact, it has nothing to do with whether they've made like a correct diagnosis. It has to do with their communication. And that's what we want the peers to assess, is how well the clinical communication went in this scenario. So when I build rubrics, there's a lot of things to do, but the first thing you want to do is identify your latent trait of interest and then look for some starting point. So in this case, I have an oral communication value rubric from the AAC&U. The value rubrics are intended to be very broad focused, which I think makes them good starting points. Very rarely would you wholesale adopt a value rubric, but that's a great place to start if you're looking for this type of trait. Always consult with literature, ask your specialists, build a path diagram. I'll show you mine on the next slide. Separate your observables into levels, and then recheck to make sure you're aligned with the actual ability. Throughout all these bullet points here, I do think that sometimes people lose track of the original latent trait that they're trying to look at. So do your best to, once you've got that good looking rubric that you think looks great, take some moment, step back and say, hey, does this really assess the latent trait that we were interested in? So this is what a path diagram looks like, and I'm looking at this latent trait here of oral communication, which I've broken down into 5 subtraits, right? And this pretty much comes from the value rubric. And then each of those subtraits has an associated set of observable behaviors. Those are designated by squares. Latent traits are in circles, observables are in squares. And then each of those observations would have some sort of error term associated with it. So that's math jargon, and it's not that important. But this path diagram is going to be very influential to building the rubric. And this is what the rubric looks like. And it's not a perfect rubric. There's a couple places where I think it's a little redundant, and a couple places where I can see some ambiguity where someone might not know which place to pick. But in general, it really focuses on the behaviors, these squares that you see at the bottom here. And that's what you want when you're trying to have peers assess, because they can focus on behaviors, right? If they saw something here like a speaker made eye contact with the patient, but contact may have been inconsistent, or speaker spent too much time referring to materials, that's an observable behavior. We don't need a whole lot of training to have students do that. Some more of the rubric, and there we go. There's the last part. You're welcome to pause on any of these particular slides. So like I said, there's 3 slides here: organization, delivery on slide 12, word choice and supporting materials on slide 13, and clarity of message on slide 14, to see what an appropriate rubric would look like. And as you see here, it's important to notice that I have these values associated with my rubric, and we'll come back to those later. But what you want is a program, and Qualtrics will do that, that will give you those values back as data. So here's some rubric limitations, and this is some measurement qualifications here. The really important one is that the scores in the rubric are numerals but not numbers. 2 is not twice a 1. And that's a very important idea, because it's going to affect the mathematical operations you can do with this data set. Similarly, the 5 latent variables that I've discussed here are not expected to be equally proportionate to their loading in the oral communication. Well, they are proportionate to their loading. That's a slight typo. But I'm not saying that they're all equal to each other, right? So we're not saying that each of these 5 is 20% of the person's final score. We don't know that. With those 2 things in mind, I don't suggest you take averages or sums, and I really caution against assuming progress in a linear way, because like we said, the numerals do not connotate mathematical numbers, right? So the progress from 1 to 2 is not equal to the progress from 2 to 3. What you can do is look for agreement from multiple raters. If you have someone who's consistently rating everybody much lower than all their peers, then that person may need some intervention, because that data is telling you that this person is kind of missing the boat on what's going on in these particular situations. You can average scores from multiple raters and say, look, you had a whole bunch of people give you 3s, a couple people give you 2s. That's really good. Count functions are very good. But try not to, like I said, take an average of the 5 scores and try not to assume anything about linear progression based on the fact that the numbers have a mathematical relationship. So here's your example using Qualtrics, and really quickly, these are the things I want to go over, which is what to do with your rubric, after your students your ID numbers, you distribute your data, get into Qualtrics. Here we go. So open Qualtrics, create your survey. First page should have 4 fields. All right, so here is my survey in Qualtrics, right? And this is my clinical peer assessment rubric. And I've clicked add block here, and that makes this the first page. These 4 things: your name, your ID number, name of the peer you're assessing, ID number of the peer you're assessing. As an instructor, you'll be most interested in these ID numbers. This is kind of like a check in case someone actually puts in the ID number wrong. So after you've done that, you use multiple choice single answers to add in your rubric, and then make each one a new block. So here's what we've done here. Here's the question for organization, and then I've gone and put each of the sublevels of the rubric as a multiple choice. So let me just quickly run back to that so we can see what that looks like. So organization above standard, as you see, is the first choice right here. Organization at minimum standard is the same space right here. And all the way down below standards and failing are these 2. Okay, and we're going to do that for all 5 parts of our rubric. And I add new blocks to each one of them to make this a little bit easier to look at on the mobile device. And once you've done that, you're really close to being done. The next thing you need to do if you're using Qualtrics or another program is to click right here and hit recode values. So by default, Qualtrics will look like this. It'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, where 1 is always the first response and counting up to the number of responses you have. In my case, I want that one to be coded 3, this one 2, this one should be 1, and this one should be 0. All right, so once you do that, recode values, make sure you pick that for all of your questions. And then go ahead and put your survey in the field. Now I'm going to hit a preview here so you can see what this will look like to the students. So your students are going to see this format here. This is what it looks like on the mobile device on the right side of my screen. And this is what it looks like on a personal computer. Click right here to go to the next one. And now when they get to the rubric, all they need to do is click one of these buttons. It'll highlight, and then they hit next. And click one of these buttons, and it'll highlight, and they click next. And they do that 5 times. And that's it. So I'm just kind of clicking randomly here. And there we go. That's the end of their survey. It actually generally takes longer for people to enter the correct ID numbers than it does to do this form of assessment. So once you've had some students do that, you have some data, what you do is you go over here to data and analysis. And you want to click this drop down where it says export and import and click export data. And you want to download the data table. Right here, comma separated value is the format that's going to read into Excel very easily. You can also read into SPSS for another statistical analysis program if you wanted to do that. Stata R. Make sure you change this to use numeric values for the fields, and that's going to give those recoded values instead of the rubric responses. And then right here, you'll click download. All right, so I've done this a couple times, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. So you'll get a sheet that looks like this. I've mocked up a couple of results, and these first couple of columns here, this is just start date, end date. These don't mean very much. All of these things I'm just going to go ahead and hide, because here is the core of our data. Go ahead and hide this row here too. This is the core of our data right here. This is the assessor. This is the assessor's ID, and this is the person they are assessing and their ID. And now we see that these are the results of that assessment. 00110. This assessor was apparently not very impressed with person AC, thought they did not do a very good job, as opposed to someone like this, who thinks that this particular student right here did a much better job, right? Couple threes, a 2, a 3, only a 1. That's the data that you want. Now again, this is Excel. You can use count formulas, you can use sum formulas, anything like that. But right here, this is the core of your data. That's what you wanted. That's why we created this whole method. Infinite number of ways you can use this. As long as you're responsible and you've planned this beforehand, I would say go for it. But this is what your data is going to look like at the end, and that's the useful part. So after you've recoded the values, you've exported the raw data. Obviously, you do that after you've distributed the survey. Make sure your links are easily accessible. Very important that you stress this idea of correct ID numbers. That's going to be your sorting variable in most cases. Finally, you interpret, use, and distribute the data. You have the option to anonymize your results. That can be useful. In some cases you might want to, in some cases you might not want to. If these people are working these small groups consistently, then getting them into the habit of peer assessing each other and lowering the assessment stigma would be a good option. Conduct your analyses. Align them with your longitudinal goals and adjust your instruction or your instructional goals. Offer your feedback or interventions as needed. Remember here that the people recording the data is just as much a source of data as the data yourself. You might calculate, for example, standard deviations, and if someone is consistently below or consistently above the mean for the peer they are reviewing, that might be something that you need to look at, right? Because they may be misunderstanding some of the assessment standards. That's pretty much all I've got. The last thing I would just put on the table is recorded data is only as good as your interpretation of it. So I always encourage data collection, but please do it purposefully. And I've emphasized that several times. I think that's really important here. So hopefully this was helpful. Please send me an email if you have any questions. Thank you.